Last time we were talking about the kinds of puzzles that start motivating Frege, and today I want to try to be more precise about what his solution is. Last time we were talking about the general idea that in addition to the reference of a term, something in the world that it corresponds to, you've got a sense, which is something like a way of picking out that reference, a mode of presentation of that referent, or something that leads you in some way to it. And so the point of introducing the sense is that it's something outside of the mind. You and I can share the same sense, even though we have different concepts with different, let's say, definitions of what a triangle is, and different emotive content connected to whatever concept that is, a different tone, you might say, emotionally speaking. Now, triangles, it's unlikely that we have much of a tone, but we could. Other things, we might have a much stronger tone. And even triangle is the kind of thing that, it might depend on the context a lot. When we're thinking in terms of geometrical triangles, it's unlikely that we have much of a context that supplies emotional content, unless you, for example, either love or hate geometry. I happen to love it, so I see a triangle, it's like, yay, geometry. But in other contexts, it might mean something different. So in any event, those things are all inside the mind. Those things are all subjective. But what Frege is looking for is not just something where you and I might vary and have different ways of picking out the same object, something that really constitutes something like the meaning of the term. So triangle has a meaning, is the idea, and it's by virtue of that meaning of the term, its sense, that we're able to pick out triangles. And the same thing is true of, let's say, blue. Blue is something that has a sense. That is to say, the word blue has a sense, and that enables us to pick out blue things. Now, you and I might have individual concepts of blue. We might have different associations of blue. All of that is subjective, but there is something that is actually an objective meaning. And so the sense is supposed to be something outside your head or my head. A bit like Plato's forms. Well, let's see how this idea helps him to solve the puzzles we were discussing last time. Remember, we had these identity puzzles. And so what do they look like? Well, classic one is the morning star is the evening star. And we had a number of variants on that. You might have proper names involved, for example. So one of the ones we considered was Bruce Wayne is Batman, and so on. Now, in general, we've got then A equals B, where those are different signs, different terms, and that can seem informative in a way that A equals A does not seem informative. So how does that happen? Well, here is the general idea. We've got something like the sense of a term. So let's let the sense of some term T be just represented as, like S of T. Okay, that'll be T's meaning. That will be its sense, and that's something outside the head. We can also talk about concepts of T, associated with T and so on, but then we would have to put an index for a person, because then your concept might be different from my concept. But we don't need that variable for a person. When we think about senses, it's just the sense of that term. So we can talk about the sense of Batman, the sense of Bruce Wayne, the sense of the term the evening star, and so forth. Now, it won't just be terms. Sentences will have a sense as well, as we'll see. And then what about the referent? Well, the referent of T, we can let that be R of T. So, now the idea is that the sense picks out the referent. So if we know the sense, we have some way, given the facts, of figuring out what the referent is, or if there is a referent at all. As we'll see, an interesting example comes up when there is no referent, or when there's more than one referent. There are many people running around calling themselves Batman, let's say. Then we get special problems. But now, if we think of it in these terms, we can say, okay, so what's going on here? Well, the idea is that the referent of A is equal to the referent of B. And of course, the referent of A is equal to the referent of A. So in both cases, we've got these being true because of that. But on the other hand, the sense we associate with A is not equal to the sense we associate with B. And that's how it can be informative. So we get information because we've got these two things with different senses, and we find out they have the same referent. Okay? We've got this sort of situation. We have A here and B here, and then the same thing, the same object. And it's informative to find out that they denote the same thing. They have the same referent. This is the referent of A, which is equal to the referent of B. But of course, they have different senses. There are different meanings attached to them. Now, so far, you might think, well, how does that really address anything? Well, it tells us something important about really what it is to be informative. Okay? Why is it trivial to say the morning star is the morning star, and not trivial to say the morning star is the evening star? Because in one case, we're really just saying something that conveys no very useful information. The morning star is the morning star. That's true if and only if the referent of the morning star is the referent of the morning star, and of course it is. And so you might think, look, we get no information from that. Again, we'll come back to this question of what if it doesn't exist. But the morning star is the evening star. We've got two different senses, and so to be told the referent of those two terms with two different senses is the same gives us real information. Now, if we look at what Frege says about senses, we'll see some other interesting claims here. Okay, a difference can arise only if the difference between the signs corresponds to a difference in the mode of presentation of that which is designated. Let ABC, for example, be the lines connecting the vertices of a triangle with the midpoints of the opposite sides. The point of intersection of A and B is then the same as the point of intersection of B and C. So we have different designations for the same point. And those names likewise indicate the mode of presentation. So his example here is a triangle. We've got lines between each vertex and the midpoint of the other side. So let's see, here's the midpoint. And then if we do this in here, if I've drawn it correctly, we should get the same point there where all of those lines intersect. And so we can refer to that point as the intersection of these two lines, the intersection of those two lines, the intersection of those two lines, etc. And all of those end up being the same thing. And that's a substantive mathematical theorem. It's not a trivial thing. And so we gain real information. So he says, there is, in addition to the referent of the sign, what I'd like to call the sense of the sign, wherein the mode of presentation is contained. So, it's clear from the context that by sign and name, I've here understood any designation representing a proper name. But of course, he also has descriptions, like the morning star is the evening star, as his example. So we distinguish those from the conception, so these are outside. Now, there are two principles that Frege, yes, go ahead.
Could there be any A and B such that the reference is the same, but the sense is also the same?
Oh, sure. So yes. Let's think about the case where we've got two terms that are different terms, right? But nevertheless, you might say not only is the referent the same, the sense is just the same. What would be examples of that? So here we've got, yes, if you want to think of it this way, we've got the sense here, which helps us to determine the denotation, the referent. And now imagine that we've got two terms, each of which have the same sense. So it's not just that we have the same object here, we've got two different terms here, T1 and T2, let's say, but they end up having exactly the same sense. What would be an example of terms that just have exactly the same? Yeah?
Like firefly and lightning bug?
Ah, firefly, lightning bug, yes. You might say the sense is just the same. They're two different words for the same thing. It's not really like evening star and morning star, where those are, as it were, two different ways of getting at the same thing. Lightning bug and firefly just mean the same thing, right? And it's not just that they refer to the same class of insects. It's sort of like, oh, wow. Now, you could have different associations. Maybe as a child you called them lightning bugs, and only later did you learn the term firefly. And then you saw the Miyazaki movie, Grave of the Fireflies. And so now firefly brings this, overwhelming sense of pathos to you. Whereas lightning bug is like, oh, we used to run around the backyard and trap them in little jars. And that's, so there could be different emotional senses, but on the other hand, it looks like the meaning is just the same. What are some other examples of that? Yeah.
Wait, for that example, how do they have the same sense?
Yeah, good. How do they have the same sense? Maybe we're too quick. What is the sense, the meaning we should attach to something like firefly?
Something that gives out light, illumination.
Something that gives out light. Well, that's not a firefly, but an insect that gives off light, right, as it flies around. Suppose we try that out. Now, lightning bug, how would you describe the sense of it?
I would say the sense is in the species, right? Because it's the same thing. It's the same bug.
Ah, okay, good. Somebody who's thinking more biologically would say, well, wait, there's a certain species here. And maybe the referent is the species, but at any rate, you might think the sense is just the species. So, but on the other hand, it's hard to sort of differentiate. Anyway, yeah.
But in your previous example, you said the sense, like you could have a different sense from firefly and ladybug based on your experience.
No, that's the concept. So the conception is something that is going to be your particular way of thinking of it. And that will have a cognitive component. Well, I should be careful here. Actually, he's using the conception for the cognitive component. So that's going to be whatever you in particular have as a concept. And that can vary from person to person. In addition to this conception, there are these emotional associations that go along. So there's, as it were, this cognitive part of what is subjective in you, and then this non-cognitive, this additional association, emotive part. And incidentally, we should be careful to distinguish those too, because there are certain associations you have, and then certain emotional tones that go along with those, and those are two different things. But those are different.
Everyone has the same sense for a given word.
Is that true? Does everyone have the same sense? We've been saying, we want it to be something outside of the head so it's not strictly subjective. But now, are there ever times where people have different senses associated with the same word? Some of you are nodding yes. What would be an example of that?
If someone was confused about the meaning of the word, like if they were wrong.
Okay, good. Somebody could just misunderstand the meaning, right? And you see this in freshman papers all the time, right? Where somebody thinks they know what a word means and they don't know what it means. There are certain public figures who specialize in this is where I can tell. And there are certain comedians who make a big deal out of this, scuffle using the wrong word and so forth. So you could just be using the word incorrectly. Are there other cases? Yeah.
Philosophy?
Ooh, philosophy. Yes. Okay, good. You mean the term itself?
Yeah.
Yeah, it might be that people have not only different concepts of philosophy, but really attach different meanings to the terms. And so what would be a way in which somebody might use it that deviates from most people's usage? Well, actually, there's this sort of technical usage we have in academia, right? The Department of Philosophy. But then other people say, oh, yeah, that's my philosophy. And it's stuff that isn't exactly, something you'd hear in a classroom. Like, yeah, get them before they get you. That's my philosophy, right? Where it's like, well, yeah, I mean, that's a different sense of philosophy from this. And so sometimes it's just an ambiguity of the term. And somebody is using it in one way and somebody else is using it in another way. So somebody might be wrong. There might be multiple usages. It may be that some terms are just vague. And the way in which you're using it, your sense, is different from mine because there's a certain vagueness. And you're, as it were, making the term precise in one way and somebody else is making it precise in a different way. There are court cases about this kind of thing, where the question in the contract is, okay, I promise to deliver you some chickens. And then I give you a bunch of old hens. And you say, what do you mean? I wanted chickens I can actually fry up and serve to my customers. And so in short, or I give you a bunch of baby chicks. And I say, those are chickens. And you say, no, they're not. And so in short, yeah, it might be that we attach different meanings to the term and among different people. Yeah.
So going back to the firefly, wouldn't two different senses be like an insect that gives off light just one sense and the whatever name it is, I forgot what it's called, but the biological name for the firefly is a different sense?
Yeah, no, I think the biological name would have a different sense, because it really says, look, it's this specific species in this specific genus. And that presumably is going to have a different sense. But on the other hand, at least the way I use firefly and lightning bug, they just stand for exactly the same idea, as it were, in my head, and exactly the same sense, I would think, because I attach the same meaning to both. They're just linguistic variants. I mean, can you think of other cases where we have two terms for what is really exactly the same thing? I mean, what do you call terms that just have the same meaning?
Synonyms?
Yeah, synonyms. So just think of synonyms. What are some examples of synonyms?
Soda and pop.
Ah, soda and pop, yeah. Okay, I grew up in a place where it was called pop. And then I moved and learned that I was now considered something between an alien and an imbecile for using that term, and sort of adapted. So yeah, that's something that, look, they just mean the same thing. Or other examples.
Like a lot of cross-cultural things, like a lift and an elevator.
Ooh, lift, yes, exactly. The British have different terms for lots of things. So lift and elevator, bathroom and loo, et cetera, those really just mean the same thing. It's sort of dying out now, but for a long time, refrigerator and icebox were like this. Icebox was kind of the old-fashioned term for a refrigerator. Now nobody remembers that they used to have just big blocks of ice at the top to keep everything cold, and so that term is sort of gradually dying out. But yeah, those are things where, look, the meaning is just the same. They're fully synonymous. Now, we're going to consider later attacks on that idea of synonymy. Quine is going to say, what do you mean they're synonyms? What do you mean they have the same meaning? All this talk of meanings, of synonymy, and so on doesn't make any sense at all. So, for now, we'll just be naive and pre-Quinean and assume that makes sense. But yeah, I think there are times when we just have two words that have exactly the same sense. Also, we can do this if we think cross-linguistically. Right. Think about the English term red and the German rot or the French rouge or whatever. We might say those are just synonyms, right? That term in this language means the same thing as that term in that language. And there we'll have two different words that have exactly the same meaning. Yeah.
Is it that they mean the same thing to a specific person, or they mean something like to the same thing to everyone?
Yeah. Good. In the case of something cross-linguistic, presumably lots of people won't know what that means because they don't speak that language. And so it won't be for everyone, for sure. And in fact, and yet we don't want to say, oh, it's just this one person. You know, here's this one person who speaks both French and English, and that person uses these and attaches the same meaning, so they're synonymous. It becomes complicated, actually, in those kinds of cases. And often there are shades of meaning that seem to get lost in translation, for example. So yeah, what you're raising is a really good question. It's not a simple matter. Now, sometimes I think it really is. Sometimes there's a word and you say, oh, it just is the equivalent of the English one. And the linguistic roles they play match up precisely. But often they don't match up precisely. And then, yeah.
So the idea of sense is that two people can, but not necessarily have the same sense about a specific word.
Right, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, anyway, I think that's possible. How often it happens is a real question. And whether there's any sense to this idea of sense at all, of course, is a different kind of question that Quine will raise later. All right, now, here is Frege's idea about the way this all works. He says, how do we figure out the meaning of a sentence? Not just a term like Batman or the Morning Star, but a sentence like the Morning Star is the Evening Star, or Bruce Wayne is Batman. We need to talk about the meanings of sentences, the sense of a sentence, as well as the referent. And so he has principles that are generally called principles of compositionality. In this particular article, he doesn't actually articulate those, though they're hovering in the background, and they drive some of the things he says. So what are these principles? Well, the sense of the whole is a function of the senses of the parts. So let's call that the first principle, the sense version of that principle. So how do I figure out the meaning of something like the Morning Star is the Evening Star? I think about the meaning of the morning, star, is, evening, and I put them together in this way. So now, they're going to be, what kind of function? It depends really on the form of the sentence. So the logical form will determine the particular function we use to put those together. It will depend on how those words are combined. We take the meanings of words basically and combine them to get meanings of sentences. And now he thinks the same thing is true of the reference. So the reference of the whole is a function of the reference of the parts. Maybe I should really say referent here, reference of the parts. Now, this, it turns out, is going to tell us some interesting things and also lead to some problems. And we can already get a sense of the problems, but, well, why do I say that? We can already get a sense of the problems. Yeah?
Yeah, with Firefly and Lightning Bug, if you just take it into parts, then they'll mean very different things.
Ooh, good, 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 because we'll get the meaning of lightning and the meaning of bug, right? And how do we combine those to get the meaning of lightning and bug? You'll think, lightning, I know what that is. Boom, well, I'm making the sound of thunder, but it's really the flash of light, right? So, flash of light, insect. Now, there's a way of putting flash of light and insect together to get the meaning of lightning bug, but on the other hand, it's not the first thing you would think of, right? And so, actually, you would think, yeah, there are going to be certain things like that that are problems. So, we're going to have, a number of things that arise as issues here. And one will be idioms. Lightning bug is an example of one of those, where you might think you combine the meaning of lightning and bug, and you don't really exactly end up with lightning bug and the meaning of that. So, and with the reference too, think insects. Massive electrical discharges, and put them together, and there's no overlap there, right? So it's not clear how that's going to work. So idioms like that, or kick the bucket for dying. I know what buckets are. I know what kicking is. In fact, I know one meaning of kicking the bucket. You can walk over. I was painting, and I made a mess because I kicked the bucket, and the paint spilled all over. But that's not going to keep you dying, and so that's something that is going to be, and that's one of the things that's hardest in the way of learning other languages. There are all these idioms. I was in Costa Rica a few years ago, and Costa Ricans really know how to party. I mean, they put me to shame. Anyway, we were out at some comedy club at 2 in the morning or something, and it was there was this game called No Mismo. It's not the same. Okay, and people would get up and say, this is not the same as that, and it was an audience participation thing. People would get up from the audience and go up to the microphone and say, this is not the same as that, and everyone would laugh. And I knew enough Spanish to understand most of the words, but it was all based on idiomatic meanings, and so I had no idea why any of it was funny. And, well, I won't give you examples because they're sort of lewd. I only found out later a lot of this was lewd. That's why everybody was laughing the way they were. These were sort of sexual innuendos. But at the time, I was like, telescopes? I'm sorry, I don't get it, So I could. It was interesting because when other Americans spoke Spanish, I understood them perfectly. When real native Costa Ricans spoke Spanish, I could understand most of it, but I didn't get the idioms, and so frequently I didn't understand jokes. By the end of my stay, people said, "Oh, your Spanish has improved so much. You now understand so much. You're laughing at all the jokes." Well, it was just a question of I realized I don't get any of this, so when everybody else laughs, laugh. That was my rule, and it made me look like I was really a good Spanish speaker, but in fact it was just like, I had no idea what was going on. Okay, so there are idioms that are a problem. Are there other kinds of problems that are going to arise as a result of these principles? I mean, they're natural enough, right? You think, how do we understand the meanings of sentences? We take the meanings of the words and somehow combine them. How do we figure out whether a sentence is true or false? Well, we look at the various things that are referred to. What's the referent of Bruce Wayne? What's the referent of Batman? And we say, oh, they're the same. And that tells us, now that's interesting. What does it tell us? The referent of Bruce Wayne is the same as the referent of Batman. So the sentence is,
Bruce Wayne is Batman.
well, yes, the sentence is Bruce Wayne is Batman, but I mean, what I was looking for is the sentence is true by virtue of that. And so one thing that, we'll look at his argument in a minute to see whether it works, but here's the idea that Frege thinks follows from this. The referent of all true sentences is the true. And similarly, all false sentences refer to the false. Okay? We'll see why he thinks that in a moment. Are there other problems? Here's the one that really bugs him, and that forces him to do some things that have led to a large literature. He thinks of it in terms of indirect discourse. But we can already see the problem arising when we say, this sentence is informative, or this sentence is informative, even though Batman's Batman is not informative, right? Now, why? Well, think about what this means. The sense of the whole is a function of the senses of the parts. So if we substitute for some part of a sentence something that has the same sense, we should preserve the sense, right? So this is going to imply that substituting terms, and really I should just be saying expressions, I'm being sloppy and saying terms, but imagine that this could be a whole sentence as well as an individual expression like Batman or the Morning Star or something. So substituting expressions with the same sense preserves sense, the sense of the whole, and also, of course, well, the second one is going to imply that substituting terms or expressions with the same referent preserves reference. And in the case of sentences, of course, that's going to mean truth value. Now, in part, that looks good. If we substitute Bruce Wayne for Batman, in Batman is Batman, we get Bruce Wayne is Batman. It's still true, right? The Morning Star has the same referent as the Evening Star, and so the Morning Star is the Morning Star, true. Substitute the Evening Star for the Morning Star, and get the Morning Star as the Evening Star, still true. On the other hand, if we substitute things with the same sense, we preserve sense. So, we trapped a lightning bug. We trapped a firefly. Those should agree in truth value. And it's fine to have these different senses, but now that means the Morning Star is the Morning Star. That will typically be expected to have a different sense from the Morning Star is the Evening Star. It's not guaranteed here, but it is something that we would ordinarily expect. So all that looks good. But now, are there cases where substituting something with the same truth value, for example, a sentence with the same truth value, leads to a failure, produces a different truth value in the compound sense, for example, or where substituting something with the same referent actually leads to a different truth value. Bruce Wayne is Batman? That looks like a case where it works, but could we make it fail? What about this? Commissioner Gordon knows that Bruce Wayne is Bruce Wayne. He's studied intro logic. He knows things are self-identical. And so he says, ask Commissioner Gordon, hey, Bruce Wayne, that very rich guy, is he Bruce Wayne? Yeah, Bruce Wayne is Bruce Wayne, right? That's a stupid question. But now, we've said Bruce Wayne is equal to Batman, so does it follow that Commissioner Gordon knows that Bruce Wayne equals Batman? Plainly not right. We've substituted something with the same referent in a sentence, and we don't get the same referent. We've changed truth value. Ooh, well now once you start thinking about that, you realize this happens all the time. Okay? And it happens in all sorts of contexts. Let's go back to these examples over here. Remember, our puzzle from the start was this is informative, right? And this is informative. But now, look at the problem. Well maybe we could just say, it's informative that the morning star is the evening star, right? That represents a real discovery. But if I substitute something with the same referent, it's informative that the morning star is the morning star? No, that's not right. Right? Or, it's a priori that a soul is a soul, to steal the example from Locke. But now, imagine that you've got something that has the same referent as the soul. What would that be? I don't know. Tell me your favorite. It doesn't matter if you really believe it or not. Suppose somebody says, what is a soul? What would be one possible answer?
Spirit.
Consciousness?
So, okay, let's just say consciousness. So it's a priori that a soul is a consciousness. Ooh, that's not so clear, right? Or, you might think this is in the end a sort of discovery, or let's take something that's not so spiritually loaded. It's a priori that a firefly is a firefly, but now it's a priori that a firefly is, well now I don't know what the biological designation of firefly is, but where that's the biological name for it. That's not a priori, that's something that has to be discovered, right? And you have to say, this insect is of a certain genus and it's this specific species and so forth, and that can be complicated. Think, it's a priori that a human being is a human being, but that a human being is Homo sapiens. That's something that represents some kind of empirical discovery. It's not just a priori, I think. So it's a priori that, it's informative that. Those are going to be problems. In general, indirect quotation is what starts bothering Frege. So, the logic teacher said that Batman is Batman. But now Batman is Bruce Wayne, we've said, so the logic teacher said that Bruce Wayne is Batman. Right? Looks like this is true, maybe, and this is false. And so something weird goes on in these cases. Now, if you've taken logic, you're probably seeing a certain pattern here, right? We say that a connective, a way of linking sentences to form compound sentences, is truth functional if and only if the truth value of the compound formed by means of the connective, I'll just shorten that to the compound, is a function, is completely determined by the truth values of the components. And we give examples in logic of truth functional connectives, where to find out whether the compound sentence is true, for example, you just have to know the truth values of the component sentences. So what's an example of a truth functional connective?
Conjunction.
Good, conjunction. like and, okay? I say it's Wednesday and I'm teaching Frege. That's true if and only if it is Wednesday and I'm teaching Frege. So P and Q is true if and only if P is true and Q is true. If either one is false, the thing is false. Other examples of true functional connectives.
Negation.
Good, negation. It is Wednesday today, right? So if I say it is not Wednesday, that's false. If I say, yeah, it's not Thursday, so if I say it is not Thursday, what I'm saying is true, if and only if today is Thursday, is false. So not is a truth functional sentence connective. What's an example of one that doesn't appear to be truth functional? Substitute something with the same truth value in the larger compound sentence, and you can change the truth value of the whole.
Something about causation or necessity.
Excellent. So necessity. Is it a necessary truth that Batman is Batman? Sure. Is it a necessary truth that Bruce Wayne is Batman? Well, maybe we're going to debate that later in the course. But if we say, yeah, think about something that's purely contingent, like I am the professor of philosophy 327 this term, that's something that's true. But if you say, you know, it's a necessary truth that Dan Bottovac is Dan Bottovac, true. It's a necessary truth that Dan Bottovac is the professor in philosophy 327 this term. That's surely not true. That could easily have turned out not to be the case if I were teaching some other course, if somebody else were teaching this course weren't even offered, etc. And so, yeah, that's an example. Go back to your causation example. What's a good causal claim that's true? We're here because it's Wednesday. Okay, maybe that's true. Now, substitute some other true sentence. Thailand is in Asia. Okay? We're here because Thailand is in Asia. That's not right. And so substituting true sentences for true sentences in causal claims doesn't preserve truth. Now, what does Frege say about this sort of thing? After all, here the claim is that the reference of the whole is determined by the reference of the parts. But we've also said, and the reference of a sentence is a truth value, it looks like that should imply that actually every connective is truth functional. But that doesn't seem to be the case. So what do we do about that? What do we do about the fact that in indirect quotation context, for example, or in the context of it is informative that, or Commissioner Gordon knows that, it looks like something else is going on. Right? It looks like we can make substitutions of things with the same referent and we screw things up. We change truth values. So it looks like we have counterexamples to Frege's principles of compositionality. Yeah.
Was that Russell's complaint?
Russell has many complaints. But yeah, this almost immediately becomes a problem. Now, as we'll see, Russell's main worry throughout all of this is what if these things don't denote at all? So, for example, what if there is no morning star? What if Batman doesn't exist? Then what do we say about these sentences? His example is the present king of France, and we'll talk about that next week. So the thing that mostly bothers Russell is the non-existence problem. But there is also this other problem of truth functionality. And he's much more aware that, wait a minute, there are these non-truth functional things. And he doesn't very much like the solution that Frege proposes. Throughout the 20th century, in fact, in this book that's recently appeared, Saul Kripke has an essay on Frege on sense and denotation, talking about the history of debates about this particular question, what you do about this. And it's something we'll see in Quine, we'll see in Kripke again, we'll see it in a variety of places throughout the semester. Well, there are a number of options. We could say, yeah, this principle is false, okay? And in fact, we could do what Quine and others later do. They say, there are contexts, there are sentences, parts of language, where this is true. And those are called extensional contexts or transparent contexts. But there are other contexts that are referred to as oblique or intentional, where this principle just fails. And so you could say this is right for a certain part of the language, it's not right for the entire language. And then you might feel various ways about that. Quine basically says, and to those other parts of the language where this fails, boo, you're unscientific, get out of here. Okay, there's something wrong with you. Now, on the other hand, later people say, oh, we have new tools and know how to deal with these, so now we're happy about them, we're all excited about them. But you might also think, no, there's another option. And that's what Frege pursues here. He says, I want to hang on to this principle. But how can he do it? What happens in something like an indirect quotation context? Like the logic teacher said that. The logic teacher said that Batman was Batman, okay? As an illustration, let's say, of the logical principle that A equals A, the reflexivity by identity. But it doesn't follow the logic teacher said that Bruce Wayne is Batman. No. Why not? What's going on with these terms? This is indirect quotation, but what if it were direct quotation, right? We'd say, the logic teacher said, Batman is Batman. Or the logic teacher said, Bruce Wayne is Batman. And now, what do we do about a case like that, where the sentence is quoted? What is the referent of that? Quote, Batman is Batman.
It's the words themselves.
It's the words themselves, okay? So you might think, look, indirect quotation is just another way of doing the same thing. What is the referent there? Well, in direct quotation, it seems to be just the signs themselves. And in indirect quotation, Frege could have said that, but he didn't. What he ends up saying is, the referent is the sense. So, there are going to be direct reference and indirect reference. And we'll say, now, Frege's view is this, basically. In some contexts, in these indirect contexts, we'll say, the referent is the sense. And one of the ways in which he gives you this is to say, look, it's very easy to generate a phrase, an expression that refers to the sense of a term. You can just say, the sense of the term, right? So, for example, you say, how would I possibly refer to the sense of firefly? Just say, the sense of firefly, okay? And the idea is that in these contexts, Commissioner Gordon knows that. The logic teacher said that. Or for that matter, it's informative that. It's analytic that. It's a priori that, and so on. What's really going on is that the referent is the sense. Now, how is that as a solution? Notice, let's take a look and just see what happens with something like these sentences. Our worry was this. We had something like, well, yeah, let's just call the logic teacher L, okay? So L said that Batman is Batman. How do we determine the reference of that sentence? In other words, whether it's true or false? Well, we think about some function of the reference of L, the logic teacher. Now, the reference of said that, the reference of B, and then presumably the reference of is, or equals. And it's a function there, but now if we have, wait a minute, the referent of Bruce Wayne is just equal to the referent of Batman, then whatever that is, it's going to have to be equal to the function, which is determined by the referent of L, the referent of said that, the referent of Bruce Wayne, the referent of Batman, and the referent of equals. Because after all, those will turn out to be just the same thing, so the function will treat them the same, and so we'll get the same truth value. And it looks like that's the problem. But now, if inside this context, the referent of B is not actually what it would normally be, but it's instead the sense of B, then we can say, aha, this is the wrong picture. What we have to say is actually, in this special context, we don't take the reference there in the normal sense. the reference is, in that context, the sense. But then, since the sense of Bruce Wayne is different from the sense of Batman, we no longer get these have to be equal. Now, writing down these, I realize that looks a little bit messy. Writing down these symbols is the kind of thing that either helps your understanding or ruins your understanding. I'm the sort of person who, as soon as it's like all vague and so on, and then the moment you put it into symbols, it's like, oh, I get it, right? You know, I read Hegel. The self is the relation that relates itself to its own self. And I think, what? And then somebody says, oh, it's just the R such that R holds between R and R. I say, oh, got it. Okay? Now, if for you, writing down these symbols makes it frightening and freaky instead of helpful, then the whole idea is very simple. It's really just a bunch of stuff. So let me simplify. You've just got this function of a bunch of stuff and then the referent of Batman. And in the same place here, you've got the function of a bunch of stuff and then the sense of Batman and Bruce Wayne and so on. And, well, actually, just take the first sentence. We've got the sense then instead of this. And now you can see, oh, when I substitute, here, the referent of Bruce Wayne is the same. So if I substitute in this, I've got to, of course, get the same value. But if I substitute here, since the sense of Bruce Wayne is different, it is not the same as the sense of Batman. And so there's no reason to expect the same value here. Okay, so, oh, that's still symbols, but I've tried to simplify a little. If that freaks you out, then don't worry. The whole idea is, well, they don't have the same sense, right? So substituting one for the other, you wouldn't expect that to preserve anything. But on the other hand, they do have the same referent. So you should be able to substitute and get the same reference. Now the meaning of the sentence, of course, will be different. But the idea here is the truth value. That reference will end up being just the same. Yeah?
So does he believe that causation works the same way? That
Ooh.
I know he says it about indirect quotation.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, in fact, I never actually said, I never articulated this, did I? Problem 3 was this indirect business. But now, I think you're pointing to problem 4, which is, okay, this is all fine and good up to a certain point. And in fact, what said that, knows that, it's informative that, and so on. All those do feel like they have something to do with the sign, right? The mode of presentation. So it's sort of plausible to say this. But what about other things that are non-truth functional? So in general, we've got non-truth functional connectives that do not seem to have anything to do with that sort of representation. So, for example, cause. Necessary. It's necessary. It's possible. Can you think of others like that? It ought to be the case. Those are not going to be truth functional, and yet they don't feel in any sense representation. So Frege's move has a certain kind of intuitive plausibility when you're talking about said that, thought that, knew that, etc. But as soon as we're not talking about representation and things that seem in some way mental, it's hard to see why the sense should be involved instead of the referent. So anyway, that is one problem we're left with. I don't think there's any solution to this in Frege that makes much sense. Why would this depend on senses? It doesn't seem to have anything to do with representation. Now, one way, there's another problem, and I'll just mention it very briefly in the last seconds. That is, you might say, the sense is what determines the referent, right? But if in these indirect contexts, the referent is the sense, then don't we have to have an indirect sense that determines that? Indirect referent as the sense? But then, can't we go up one level? After all, we might say, look, John said that Fred knew that, blah, blah, blah. And you can keep going, right? Commissioner Gordon knew that the Joker believed that Batman was so-and-so, right? I can keep going with all of this. And so, do I need a whole hierarchy, an infinite hierarchy of indirect senses at level n? Alonzo Church thought yes, and developed such a theory. But a lot of people objected and said no one could learn a language like that. You're in Latin class, and the teacher says, gosh, agricola means farmer. And you say, well, I know that's the sense, but what is the indirect sense at level 12? Well, you'll get that in fourth year Latin. No, it's not like that, right? I mean, so something weird is going on if you end up with an infinite hierarchy. All right, next time we'll look at the thought, a logical loop.